Hello, Chem students. Let's get started with today's lesson on atomic spectra. Lesson 8 in your study guides. If you'll get that out, we'll get started here. All right. So in this lesson, we're going to focus, as it says, atomic spectra, what atomic spectra is, and the experiments that give us atomic spectra. Okay, so let's get started. So another problem with classical physics happens to be with these atomic spectra. Um, uh, if you recall and remember that if you take white light and you pass it through a prism, it creates a rainbow of colors, or the visible spectrum. And the visible spectrum is continuous, where you get your reds, your orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, okay, as depicted by this picture on your screen. Um, and the key here is that you're going to get a continuous rainbow or continuous spectrum of color. And we talked about that a continuous spectrum um, means that one color or one wavelength is merging in with the other without any specific visible gaps. Okay, so for instance, if you look at this continuous spectrum, uh, again, the reds, the orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, all those colors or those wavelengths that are associated with those colors blend together, merge, and there are no gaps. As you can see by this picture here, there's absolutely no gaps. The reds merge into the, what am I saying here? The reds merge into the orange merge into the yellow, yellow into green, green into blue, blue into indigo and violet and so forth. And there's no any distinguishable gaps in between the colors that you can see. Or in other words, there's no black or empty spaces there, okay? So think about that as we talk about atomic spectra now. All right, so what occurs if you take, and this is an experiment that was done in the 1800s, 19th century, especially towards the end of the 19th century, when we're exploring black bodies and the energy emitted from atoms and the photoelectric effect. And now we have this atomic spectra phenomena. And the idea is that you're going to take essentially a gas that is going to be electrically excited. And so in other words, we're going to take a gas, some element like helium or neon or argon in the gas state, or we really can take any element in the gas state. And what we're going to do is pass an electric current through that gas. And then what's going to happen is the gas, the atoms in that gas are going to start emitting light. And the emitted light from the gas is going to go through a prism, but something weird occurs. Instead of getting a continuous spectrum, we don't get a continuous rainbow or continuous spectrum. We get what is called an emission spectrum, okay? Which is here in your notes here. Now, an emission spectrum is essentially a series of fine lines at specific frequencies, and they're going to be separated by black spaces. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. So these excited gases are going to create what is called a discontinuous spectrum instead of a continuous spectrum. Now, this is very puzzling because scientists predicted, again, based on classical physics, that if you pass an electric current through a gas, that the gas should be emitting light in a continuous spectrum or continuous way. And that, so you should see all the colors of the light and not certain or only specific colors separated by these dark or black lines, okay? So the fact that we use this word discontinuous spectrum, it kind of indicates that there might be some quantum behavior going on in this case here. So this is what we're talking about in this picture. Again, you can see the continuous spectrum that contains all the rainbow colors. And this is what scientists, physicists believed would happen, the outcome of passing an electric current through a gas that would be creating a continuous spectrum of colors. But instead, what we get is this essentially emission spectrum, where we only have certain colors that are indicated by these lines, all right, and then you have all of this black or empty space in between. And so what we get is not only what we call the emission spectrum, but it's sort of like a line spectrum because of the individual lines that we see from the colors. And so there's gaps. In this particular emission spectrum, there's a gap from red to yellow. And all of the other colors in between are missing. They're gone. It's as if the atoms in the gas are only emitting certain colors and not all colors. And this is odd, right? We didn't expect this to happen. Certain classical physics did not predict that this would happen, that atoms would only be emitting certain colors of light at certain wavelengths, and some colors are just completely absent or not emitted at all right? Now, an absorption spectrum, which is listed here, that's kind of the opposite of an emission spectrum. It basically shows gaps where the color has been absorbed by atoms in these gases. So where it's dark here, it means that that color is missing because the atom absorbed that frequency or that wavelength of color right here. And so it looks dark when we look at it because that color has been absorbed completely by atoms. So with an emission spectrum, we see the lines or color of lines where that's what's being emitted by atoms, where the absorption is the color of light that's being absorbed by atoms. Okay, so hopefully you kind of see the difference there. So this is kind of the experimental setup to the process to create an emission spectrum. We take a gas that's in a tube and we zap electricity through it, electric current, and it begins to radiate light off of that, okay? And then it directs through a split, which goes through a prism. And the light is bent going through that prism, but instead of getting the characteristic continuous spectrum, we get an emission spectrum or a line spectrum, where again, we only see certain colors being emitted. So this is known as the hydrogen's emission spectrum. And what is indicated by this spectrum, emission spectrum of hydrogen, is that hydrogen, the atom hydrogen, can only emit certain colors. It can emit red light, it can emit what's called blue-green, blue-violet, and violet. And it even indicates the wavelengths here of those emitted colors. So in other words, hydrogen atoms can only emit red light at 656.2 nanometers, or blue-green at 486.1 nanometers. That's the only colors, these four colors, that hydrogen seems to emit no matter what. All of the other colors, hydrogen doesn't emit. We have these gaps, these dark gaps. And again, this is strange. Why? Why only these 4 colors? Why not other colors? And why do we have colors missing in the first place? All right. Now, I will tell you right now, this is super important. You must know the hydrogen emission spectrum. You need to be able to draw it. In other words, need to be able to tell me the colors in the spectrum, the red, the blue-green, the blue-violet, and the violet, those 4 colors. You should be able to show me the gaps or the distance in gaps. In other words, you should show that the gap between red and blue-green is much larger than the gap between blue-violet and blue-green, and violet and blue-violet, the gap is the smallest, okay? That's important, the spacing or the gaps in between the colored lines, okay? You do not have to memorize the wavelengths of those colors. Don't memorize them. You can if you want, but you don't have to memorize them. But you do need to know the hydrogen's emission spectrum. Super important, okay? All right, so here we go again, the hydrogen emission spectrum. Just one more time, again, the reds, the blue-greens, the blue-violet, and the violet. The 4 colors emitted by hydrogen. Notice the big gap in between the red and the blue-green, and all of these other colors are absent or missing. They're not and cannot nor ever be emitted by hydrogen atoms. All right, and again, why? Why is this the case? What's going on here? All right, so you might take a look at this photo. This is the real look at various elements here. So we got gases in these tubes, and an electric current is being passed through that, and you can see the light being emitted from those gases. And as a whole, even the different elements you can see do emit different colors. You got helium, which helium has kind of got that orange look, but look at the neon, that beautiful neon color that you normally see like in neon signs and so forth. But then you got these more blues and purples from some of these other elements. So it definitely appears that elements can only emit certain colors and not every color. And so doesn't that sound quantum to you, that there seems to be a limitation or a limit or only certain colors? Or in other words, if we're talking about color and wavelengths, we're talking about energy then, right? That atoms tend to only emit certain energies. In fact, if we go back to the hydrogen emission spectrum, not only do we say that these are specific wavelengths of colors, but we know that these wavelengths also have frequencies. And we have learned that essentially the frequency is the basis for the quantity of energy of the particles of light that are being emitted. So in other words, hydrogen is emitting photons in the 656 nanometer range, and those photons have a specific quantity of energy. The blue-green photons are the same thing. Now these aren't really colored photons, they're particles, but they look colored based on what our eyes interprets those wavelengths at, or frequencies, remember. So, so we have to associate then these colors to photons, and each photon specific frequency, which means corresponds to a specific energy, okay? So that's important to remember, okay? Oops, going backwards here. All right. So here's some more details. So when hydrogen gas is excited by an electric current, it produces an align or an emission spectrum, which is discontinuous. And we've looked at that, which suggests that hydrogen gas is only allowed to have certain wavelengths of light. Somehow, hydrogen atoms emit energy in discrete packets that are quantized energy. In other words, we know that those discrete packets are really photons, particles of light now, okay? But why? Why do these gases only emit certain photons of light? Why do they not emit the entire spectrum of light? It seems really odd to us. And the answer is coming, but not in this lesson, okay? But it's coming up, right? We'll answer why only certain wavelengths are emitted. In other words, only certain energies or photons are emitted from these atoms, okay? So here we have a variety of different elements in what we call their emission spectrums. And if you look closely, you will notice that they are all very different from one another, which gives us further puzzling information that no element emits the same exact atomic or emission spectrum. Each element has its own unique emission spectrum. And it also tells us that there seems to be limits to every element in what light it can be emitted or what photons it can be emitted. So therefore, that means there must be a limit to the energies that these atoms can emit, okay, based on different colors. If you look at lithium, it's emitting this little blue here and indigo and so forth, okay, some greens, looks like almost a yellow and an orange and so forth, okay? So this is only what lithium can emit, these photons of light, which of course a photon is related to its frequency. It must only have certain frequencies and certain energy set, right? Total quantum here. Oop. All right, but why? What's going on again? Now, physicists do recognize that emission spectrums are very unique for each element. So therefore, the emission spectrum is also known as the element's fingerprint. And you know what fingerprints are for, right? Fingerprints are used for identification. So just as we use our fingerprints to identify us, we can use emission spectrums to identify a particular element. In fact, it's interesting to note that the element helium was discovered in this manner. We did not know that helium existed on Earth at all. The problem is that helium is a rare element on Earth. There's not a lot of it. And it's inert, meaning it's not very reactive at all. So it's not really found in compounds. So we didn't know it was there. And then all of a sudden we were looking at the emission spectrums, the light coming from stars, specifically our star, the sun. And we noticed that there was an emission spectrum that we were not familiar with. And we're like, well, what is this? And what we realized, it was the emission spectrum of an element that we had never seen before or identified. And it turned out to be helium. And so helium was discovered first by looking at stars and seeing that the light that we gathered from the stars going through an emission or creating an emission spectrum and looking at that. So it's pretty unique, awesome way of finding an element. For today, astronomers are looking out in deep space all the time and gathering light and using that light to break it down into an emission spectrum to determine what elements the universe is made out of. And so we don't even have to travel very far from our planet to know what the universe is made up of, because we can just gather the light that is being emitted from stars or other objects and gather that light, look at its emission spectrum, and identify what elements that we're seeing there. All right. Again, every element has a unique fingerprint or emission spectrum that we can use to identify. You can see these various different ones. Here's our hydrogen again, okay? Pretty cool, I think, all right? So, but none of this explains why, right? None of this explains why is it that when we pass an electric current through a gas, that the atoms emit only certain wavelengths or frequencies of light? Why is only certain photons being emitted with certain specific quantized quantities of energy? All right, they just didn't know and understand that, okay, as we do now know today. Well, we're not going to answer that question for you right now. We're going to answer it a little bit later in another lesson, okay? Now, this is really pretty much it for this video. I do want to show you kind of a video, a demonstration of this, so that you can watch it and kind of see what it looks like in real life. The plan is that we will do our own experiment in class for atomic spectra, and so that you can see this firsthand, okay? But for now, we'll show this using a video. So you're trying to share it here. See if we can get it to share. There we go. Okay. All right, here we go.
One of our funnest demonstrations to show atomic spectra. I'm going to show the spectrum of an incandescent bulb, which is continuous. And then I'm going to show the spectra of 4 different elements: mercury, nitrogen, neon, and especially hydrogen. Hydrogen will be important in the labs and in many other applications. So to show a spectrum, what we use is called a diffraction grating. This looks like a piece of clear plastic, but it's not. It is actually a piece of clear plastic on which an image has been inscribed with dark line, clear line, dark line, clear line, with about 10 to 13,000 lines per inch. So it's called a grating, just like a street grate. It has lines through it. And this allows you to resolve the spectrum of a source of light in the same way that a prism will resolve a spectrum. So what we're going to do is to place this diffraction grating in front of a camera and show you the view of this continuous source with the diffraction grating in place. And what you'll see in the image is the image of the incandescent bulb itself, and then to the right and to the left, you'll see a rainbow spectrum that shows what wavelengths are present in this. You'll see, as you look on the right side, violet through all the colors of the spectrum, all the way through red. So that's a continuous spectrum. We'll try next to look at a discrete spectrum of mercury. Now what this is it's a discharge tube. It has mercury in it, and what I'll do is energize this tube, apply a voltage to the tube, and that causes the gas in it to emit spectral lines according to the spectrum of the element that we're using, in this case mercury. So I'm going to locate this, its proper spot, turn off the continuous spectrum. So this is a mercury spectrum without the diffraction grating. And let me get it in focus here. It's a bluish colored spectrum. There are mercury vapor lights that are used as street lights. So this may look similar to this bluish tint to the mercury vapor. Now let's try it with the diffraction grating in place. And what you see in this case are a green line and a blue line predominantly in this mercury spectrum. Next we will try a nitrogen spectrum. I'm using this fur to prevent burning flesh. So this is nitrogen spectrum. And with the diffraction grating in place, we see a number of lines present, some red, orange, yellow, green, and a violet turquoise-ish colored line. That's nitrogen. Two more. This is neon. There's a beautiful orange look to it, and when the diffraction grating is in place, you see a large number of red and orange lines. This is exactly what's used for neon lights. The original neon light was made out of neon like this. There are other gases that are used to form signs, but neon was really where it started off as a beautiful, bright, reddish orange spectrum. So this is hydrogen. It has a reddish cast to it. And when the diffraction grating is in place, you'll see three lines. The farthest from the central image is a red line. That's the hydrogen alpha line. And it is very important in star images. A lot of nebula in the sky have hydrogen alpha line as one of their prominent spectral lines. Then there's a turquoise colored line, greenish blue is the hydrogen beta line, both from the Balmer series, and we'll talk about those, or have talked about those in class. And then finally, the hydrogen gamma line is a violet line, is generally considered to be the one that's, those three lines are visible in the hydrogen spectrum. Those lines are associated with transitions of the electron.
All right, so we're gonna stop here, but you can basically see hydrogen here, as you mentioned, and we're gonna see something very similar when we actually do this in a laboratory setting. Here we're only seeing sort of the three colors and not the four, but you do see the red, the blue, green, and the violet, and you're kind of missing the blue violet here, but it's there. It just is not as prominent in this particular spectrum. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll do a lab with this, and then in our next lesson, we're going to talk about what's going on here. Why do we see this occur? Why do we not see a continuous spectrum? All right, so that's it for today. I'm going to sign off then, and we'll see you later.